Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for coming down this lovely afternoon. I'm Pete Lentini. I'm the Foundation Director of the Global Terrorism Research Center. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome our guest today, Professor Bjorgo from the Norwegian Police University College. And he's been certainly a celebrity and also I think one of the inspirations for many of us in this field, and also particularly at Monash University. Among his many publications, he's worked on issues such as the root causes of terrorism, looking at extraction patterns from different forms of extremism. He's written a number of different works on that, and in fact, we could probably say that the global movement towards terrorist rehabilitation was probably initiated by Professor Bjorgo's work. And it certainly had a profound impact on the stuff that we're doing not only in GTReC but also throughout Victoria and Australia. He's also worked on the far right. In fact, he did his PhD on that at the University of Leiden in the 1990s on that type of stuff. And he's currently in Australia visiting with a number of different academic and practitioners. And we're very, very honored and very, very pleased to welcome Professor Bjorgo, who's going to be speaking about crime prevention strategies focusing on terrorism. Professor Bjorgo, welcome, and thank you for coming.
I understand I can sit, so I will do that. As Peter mentioned, I've been doing quite a lot of work on disengagement from extremism, and that became quite popular in the late 2000s. And some thought that that is a solution to terrorism, that is new counterterrorism. And I think that is to overdo it quite a lot. I think we have to see disengagement as one element in a comprehensive strategy for preventing terrorism. And that was the idea behind the book which I published just a couple of months ago, called Strategies for Preventing Terrorism. And I'm going to present the main ideas of that book. Here, and it's kind of the Reader's Digest version of the book. I will give you a kind of summary of the main ideas. The primary objective of counterterrorism is to prevent acts of terrorism from taking place and from causing harm to people and property. And in my book, I aim to clarify the basic strategies or mechanisms which can be employed to prevent the carrying out of acts of terrorism. And I use the term prevention in a very broad sense to preventing acts or new acts of terrorism from occurring in the future, or reducing the number and severity of such acts. So the objective is to develop a comprehensive model, kind of holistic strategy for preventing terrorism with where various sub-strategies, like, for example, disengagement, can interact and complement with others, like reducing recruitment, for example, and in which the prevention roles performed by different actors within the various sub-strategies are clarified. So that's an idea about the book. The need for more comprehensive thinking about, with regard to fighting terrorism became clear in the aftermath of the terrorist attack on 9/11 in 2001. The Bush administration's war on terrorism was very heavily focused on military means, military force, repression, control, this kind of measures, and that was a very narrow focus. And I think much of what was done undermined the more long-term strategies that were aiming at doing something about the factors that give rise to terrorism and sustain terrorism in a society, and also why individuals and groups become involved in radicalized in terrorist activities. So, but on the other hand, you have other people who say that the only thing we have to do is to do something about the root causes of terrorism. Then we solve the whole problem. The problem is that when bombs are exploding around our ears, we cannot wait for 10 or 20 years in order to have the removed root causes having its effect. We need to do something here and now. So we need to have this balance between the more repressive, short-term methods and strategies in order to do something here and now together with the more long-term measures and strategies. So we need to find this balance. And in my study, I try to contribute to this. I think the idea is that that by having a more holistic approach, we can also avoid some of the overreactions which tend to happen when you focus only on a few heavy measures. We need to, by thinking more holistically, we can be softer, and I will come back to that. Also, the study aims to develop a more comprehensive model of crime prevention in general, a kind of generic model which can be applied to most types of crime. I'm actually now working on a book where I apply the same model to drink driving, to piracy in Somalia, to organized crime based on motorcycle gangs in Norway, and to burglary in private homes. Very different forms of crime, but the same preventive mechanisms can be applied. But a word of caution is needed, because there is no silver bullet which can eradicate terrorism, as there is none for crime in general. So we need to be modest about our expectation. But I think we can get further to reduce the problem by having a more broad, holistic approach, employing a multiple of preventive mechanisms and measures. And the idea is then to construct more barriers that can catch potential terrorist acts. And this means that every measure alone does not need to be so heavy for the total effect to produce adequate protection. So this broad and holistic approach can serve to lighten the pressure from the more repressive prevention measures and reduce the negative side effects. So I will analyze strategies for preventing or reducing acts of terrorism or other forms of crime by describing 9 different preventive mechanisms that can bring about such a reduction. Yeah, I think I'm a little bit behind that. It should be, yeah, okay. No, I think I'm, okay. The key analytical terms in this study are prevention, it's strategy and mechanism measures. I think I'm a bit, here we are, yeah, right. So the term mechanism describes a process in which some factors or means influence other elements and bring about a specific effect. So in other words, a preventive mechanism is an explanatory model in which is intended to describe how certain measures can create a specific effect or outcome, such as reducing terrorism or other forms of crime. Measures are the methods or deliberate courses of actions implemented to activate a specific mechanism and through this achieve an intended effect. But it's important to note that such mechanisms may have also unintended side effects, as they may also activate mechanisms other than those intended. For example, heavy-handed repressive measures to deter violence activism or to incapacitate activism may provoke anger, and it may increase recruitment to violent extremist groups, for example. So it's important to differentiate between a preventive mechanism on the one hand and the measures that are used to activate it. The same measures, for example, arrest, can trigger different mechanisms. For example, deterrence, disruption, or incapacitation. And it can be included then in several prevention strategies at the same time, but have a different preventive function in each of these strategies. And similarly, different measures can activate the same mechanism. For example, both arrest and exposure in the media can help to disrupt the terrorist plot. You can use both hard measure and soft measures sometimes to achieve the same, to activate the same mechanism. So we should keep in mind that social mechanisms do not follow the law of physical necessity. They are likely to work under some conditions and less likely to work under others. One example, for example, is the assumption that the threat of punishment deters individuals from committing crimes because they presumably will make a rational assessment, weighting the costs against the benefits, and then in turn it may reduce the motivation. And here the actual mechanism is a mental process. It happens in our head. kind of weighting for and against, a calculation. But it's far from certain that everyone will end up making the same decision. So that explains how it's not a kind of natural law. While some types of mechanisms can be abstract and mental, other types of mechanisms can be more concrete and observable. For example, incapacitation behind prison walls is quite tangible, so to speak, or a bullet in the head of a terrorist is also quite concrete, so to speak. So social and mental mechanisms are not mechanical in the sense of producing a predictable effect every time. The degree to which they work is often uncertain, and therefore there's a need to be supplemented and reinforced by more barriers in order to make the outcome more certain. So that's why we need to apply a number of different mechanisms. So this brings me to models of crime prevention. And the starting point here is that there are several models of crime prevention, and these models tend to overlap to some extent, but they appear to a great degree to be competing ways of thinking. Since they have very different theoretical bases and concerns, they may to some extent appear incompatible, so even both theoretically and practically. For example, we have the criminal justice model of crime prevention, which is based on the preventive effects of punishment. And in its simple form, it differentiates between individual prevention on the one hand and general prevention on the other. Individual is what works on the individual, like they have felt the punishment on their body, so to speak, and they have learned a lesson and they won't do it. And at the same time, when they are in prison, they are incapacitated. They cannot do anything wrong. On the other hand, you can have the general prevention working at the population level. You can have a law, say, kind of establishing a norm that something is wrong. Like, for example, in Norway, we got a few years ago, until around 2004, it was legal to provide economic support to a terrorist organization. After 2004, it was illegal. That established a norm. Now people who may want to support, let's say, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, know that if they do so, they risk punishment. They have established a norm. And they know that if someone did that they actually got punished. So they know that there is a kind of, they are deterred at a more general level. Then you have the social model of crime prevention, which attempts to influence the factors that make people criminals or get involved in crime. Criminal behavior is often understood as being caused by social marginalization, poor living conditions, and tough childhoods, or the exposure of individuals to unfortunate influences from negative social environments, peer groups, media, or intoxicants, or can also be causes. So prevention measures can be introduced at the societal level, or what we can call at the level of society, at the level of specific risk groups, or at the individual level, what we call primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Then you had what we call the situational crime prevention model, which aims at changing the situations in which criminal acts occur, and to sort of remove opportunities for crime or for terrorism. So this strategy seeks to intervene against those factors that makes it possible to carry out the criminal act. And these principles, which were originally developed by a researcher called Ronald Clark, they involved introducing measures intended to increase the efforts necessary to carry out a specific criminal act, to increase the risk of being detected and stopped, to reduce the rewards for specific criminal acts, to reduce the provocations that could trigger a criminal act, or to remove the excuses for committing the criminal acts. But they are all kind of situational. And then we have, you could also put in repressive counterterrorism here as a kind of strategy, but I will not go more into that. But the idea here is that each of these models are, in my view, too narrow and do not sort of incorporate the other perspectives in order to be holistic. They tend to see the other approaches as kind of competing And there's often been a kind of debate on which one is more knowledge-based or evidence-based, which one is more effective, better, and so on. And I think that competition is not necessary. So what I did was to try to deconstruct these different strategies and look at what are actually the preventive mechanisms used here, and then put them together again in a more holistic approach. So doing that, so I used the term preventive mechanism as organized principle, and I ended up with this. Here you have 9 different preventive mechanisms. I mean, I could have ended up with 15, but I would never have been able to remember so many. So I could have made them into 5, but that was too crude. So I thought 9 is covering quite well, and it's about as it's possible to remember all of them. The first one is to establish and maintain moral or normative barriers, that it's against the committing criminal acts. I'll go into these more in details later. And that is actually what is preventing most crime. Most of us do not commit most types of crime most of the time because it's wrong. We don't even consider to do it. So we have a lot of barriers against doing that. Some people don't have those barriers, or in specific situations, very little of them. Second one is about reducing recruitment to criminal and social environments and activities by reducing the social and individual root causes and processes that lead to criminality. The third one is deterrence, that people don't commit acts not because it's wrong, but because they fear the consequences, the negative consequences. And even if they're not stopped by deterrence, they can be stopped by disruption, that they are stopped in the process of trying to commit a criminal act. There could be a burglary alarm in a house. It could be a security guard stopping someone. It could be, for when I'm writing my chapter on drink driving, could be the wife confiscating the keys from her husband, saying, no, you're not going to drive. That's disruption. And then you can make it more difficult by protecting vulnerable targets. You could reduce the harmful consequences of criminal acts by doing some measures in advance. That could be, for example, to put, for burglary, it would be to have a home insurance. That's reducing harms. It could be for, if you are drink driving, it could be to put on the safety belt, that kind of stuff. Then you could reduce the rewards, making it less profitable. Then you have incapacitation, taking away the capacity to carry out the terrorist activity by various means. It could be to put them in prison, or it could be to confiscate their driver's license for drink driving. It could be taking away their access to guns, whatever. And the last one is disengagement and rehabilitation, to make people involved in criminal activities to stop, and preferably to get them back to a more normal life. These are the 9 generic crime preventive mechanisms. And I believe they can be applied to almost any kind of crime. And that's what I'm trying to prove in my new book. But in order to develop this generic model into a specific strategy for preventing a specific form of crime, you need to specify these models. So even if the basic structure of the model will be the same, the content with regards to the measures, the prevention actors, and the target group will differ according to the crime. You need different measures to stop burglary, or to disrupt a terrorist attack, or disrupt a piracy attack in Somalia, or drink driving. Different measures and different actors implementing them. So that's why you need to specify it. So in order to do this, you can go on using this kind of analytical scheme. And that's what I've done in my book. In this book one, I've taken each of the 9 mechanisms and described first the preventive mechanism. How does this mechanism reduce, for example, terrorism? which measures can be used to activate this specific mechanism, who are the actors possessing the relevant means, who are the target group for these measures, what are the benefits of these measures, and what are the limitation, costs, and negative side effects of these specific measures. That's the analytical scheme I use throughout the book. When I talk about the principal actors, they are those responsible for implementing the most relevant measures within the various strategies, or the various measures which can activate specific mechanisms. So, in addition to the principal actors, there may also be some actors who play kind of supplementary roles within that strategy. In some areas, for example, the police may be the primary actor, and other actors like the media or school teachers or whoever maybe play secondary roles. Police are the primary actors when it comes to disruption, incapacitation, protecting vulnerable targets, deterrence, but they play secondary role when it comes to building normative barriers, when it comes to reducing recruitment, when it comes to reducing rewards. Then there are other actors who play the primary roles. It could be parents, it could be school teachers, it could be the religious leaders who are the primary actors in those for those measures. But still, when people or agencies see their own, they have a tendency to see their own role as the most important. They attribute the greatest importance to their own role and to the measures they have at their possession. And they tend to not make use of the entire toolbox, and that is what's often happening. And it's perhaps not surprising that specialist actors like the military or the police tend to put the greatest emphasis on their measures. Sometimes we see this also at the national levels. When you have a country like the United States, which is the greatest military power on earth, they tended to place very heavy weight on their military means because no one could compete on that. And they forgot the rest of the toolbox for many years at least. So they need to, gradually, they started to realize that perhaps military means doesn't solve everything, and they started in the mid-2000s to look for other means. They started to talk about winning hearts and minds. That was totally out of the picture in the first years of the war on terrorism. But I will argue that the different strategies both can and should complement each other. And the different strategies or the different mechanisms are not mutually exclusive, but there may be significant tensions between them because the measures may have side effects which is undermining the others. So it's important then to understand how and under which conditions some strategies may undermine the others. For example, how killer and capture may undermine winning hearts and minds, so that we can reduce these undesirable side effects. Yeah, this was the one. So when we look at target groups, it's quite common to make a distinction between primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. I've added a fourth one, focusing on the victims, which are often forgotten. But primary prevention has to do with targeting entire population groups. For example, everyone within a broad category. It could be a population. It could be everyone, for example, X-raying the hand luggage of all passengers traveling by air. That's, in a way, a primary prevention is targeting everyone, even not focusing only on specific risk group, but on everyone. The second one is when we are targeting specific risk groups, who are, for example, vulnerable of developing in a negative direction or towards acts which could potentially represent the danger. One example is reporting suspicious bank transactions, what is called anti-money laundering reports. This is a form of secondary prevention. The banks and financial institutions will report to the police or to a specific financial agency that here there is a there is some kind of suspicious transaction. Another form of tertiary of secondary prevention would be looking at youth groups who are starting to develop in a criminal direction or extremist direction, even if they have not yet committed anything really criminal. That they would be a risk group. The third one is tertiary prevention, which is targeting groups that are actually involved in problem behavior, whether that is violent extremism or crime or whatever. That is what we call tertiary prevention. And then again, we tend to forget the victims, individuals who are affected, their relatives, and society as a whole. That is something we should also include in our preventive strategies. So, applied to the problem of terrorism, we have, I will now go through each of these 9 more in details. So, I will move on to the first one, which has to do with norm setting against the violence and terrorism. For most people, it would, under normal circumstances, be almost unthinkable to carry out acts of violence or inflict death or suffering upon other people to promote a political cause. The ideas goes against our conscience, the moral values of right and wrong, and most people will react emotionally to the idea of inflicting pain on other people because they are capable of feeling empathy, they have compassion for others, and even for the vast majority of those who might be angry or frustrated by political injustice, this normative or moral barrier will be sufficient to refrain them, or most of them, from getting involved in political violence and terrorism. And normative questions about legitimacy and illegitimacy immediately arise when someone makes use of violence. I mean, the term violence itself is a kind of normative concept, and terrorism in particular is a very normative concept. It has to do with illegitimate violence. But most people accept that the use of violence may be legitimate in some contexts. For example, in self-defense situations, whether it's an attack against an individual or against a country, and the state has given the police and the military, armed forces, a monopoly for the legitimate use of force within specific limits. Once they overstep those limits, that violence, that use of force becomes illegitimate. Then you can talk about police violence or what's called war crimes or state terrorism or whatever. So, but when non-state actors use violence for political purposes, they will often be accused of carrying out terrorism. And the violent actors or their supporters will naturally dispute this. They will then, hence you got this saying, one man's terrorist, the other person's freedom fighter. They will refer to some kind of injustice, to a reprisal or an active defense, or to some kind of superior moral, political, or religious principle, which they assert will legitimize their actions. So they want to put their methods in a context which gives their violence some kind of legitimacy and a just cause. So the fight against terrorism is to a large degree a normative battle, so to speak, win the hearts and minds, both of the population they claim to be fighting for and of the supporters. And in some cases even it could be that the violent actors themselves may be persuaded that maybe they are on the wrong track, and that has actually happened on quite a few occasions. And within militant movements, there are also different degrees of acceptance of various forms of violence and targets. Some group will only accept violence against material targets, but not against human targets. Some will accept violence against specific categories of people, for example, police and military personnel, but not against civilians. And still others promote mass murder against broad categories of people, but perhaps not against Muslims or against specific groups. And some appear to have no limits. But typically, terrorist movements may progress from a more restrictive towards a less restrictive use of brutal violence as a group undergoes a kind of process of radicalization. But few militant groups will go all the way towards total brutality. There are very often normative limits to what they will do. And in most cases, there will be divergent views within the movement on how ruthless means they may employ, and to what extent they should be restrained by moral and strategic considerations. So such discord is frequently a sort of defection, splits and fragmentation within militant movements, and serving to limit their violence and weaken their capacity. So this may provide opportunities which informed counter-terrorist policies should make use of. And often that is forgotten. So I think that is an opportunity which is not used. So forgetting the normative barriers is a kind of, we leave out part of the toolbox. So the preventive mechanism here consists of reinforcing objections and normative barriers to the use of violence and terrorism, and eliminating excuses and reasons for using violence. And then there are many actors who can play important roles when it comes to establishing these normative barriers to violence and terrorism. And they can use different measures. Parents, schools, religious communities play leading roles in installing kind of basic moral attitudes in children, helping them to develop empathy for other people. Our individual moral compass is not set once we leave childhood behind. It can develop and change throughout life. Norms concerning crime and violence can also change over time at the societal level as well. Politicians can pass laws, as I mentioned, that criminalize certain activities, such as providing financial or other support to terror organizations. Religious leaders can demonstrate that terrorism targeting civilian populations is contrary to Islam or to other religious or moral systems. So there are a number of actors who can play roles here. And the disadvantages and limitation of these normative preventive strategies includes the fact that some people seem to be poorly equipped with moral barriers and empathy for more poorly than most others. And some individuals appear to be completely devoid of moral scruples and compassion for others. So that, I mean, even if most of us have these barriers, some don't. The other principal limitation of the normative preventive mechanism is that people who are basically equipped with normal inhibitions against inflicting harm and suffering on other people can, under certain circumstances, bring themselves to carry out horrible acts of terrorism and violence. Researchers have pointed out to several important circumstances where this can happen. One of these processes is triggered by external events that shake a person's or a group of people's perceptions of the social, political, and moral order, something which can create what Quentin Victorovich called the cognitive opening, to turn upside down the customary notions and norms. These could be dramatic events like military invasions, massacres, police brutality, or the publication of blasphemous caricatures, as happened in Denmark. There are also many examples of traumatic events on a personal level, leading people into terroristic circles. Personal experience of ethnic and religious discrimination, or a close relative's illness and death, has been described as triggering events propelling individuals into a kind of personal crisis and into a radicalization process. The other main process that can cause completely normal people to carry out gruesome acts of violence are socio-psychological mechanisms associated with coming under the influence of strong leaders, groups, and organizational structures. And some of you know the Milgram experiments, where they set up a kind of experimental situation, and they show that ordinary university students could be forced or led into a situation where they would give very painful electric shocks, even lethal shocks to people under the strong pressure of a leader. You have the Stanford prison experiment showing much of the same. So these are situations which can make us understand why people getting into an extremist organization can change their views on violence very, very dramatically. So the next mechanism has to do with what we call social or political prevention to reduce the emergence of terrorism and violent radicalization. And terrorism does not arise in a vacuum. Social and political conditions can provide fertile ground for the growth of terrorism and violent radicalization in a society, and provocative events can trigger a violent radicalization process, both at the group level and at an individual level. So the question then is the degree to which it is possible to prevent this from happening by eliminating or reducing the conditions that give rise to such negative developments. So this has a counterpart within general crime prevention by the so-called social crime prevention strategy, doing something about the social causes. So in the context of terrorism, a social and political prevention strategy will attempt to prevent individuals or groups from being radicalized in the direction of adopting violence for political purposes. So the preventive mechanism is to reduce the driving forces and behind and the motivations for adopting the use of terroristic violence by eliminating or reducing the root causes and sources of radicalization and stopping any radicalization process as an early stage as possible. So there have been quite a lot of research in this field and quite a lot of policy development as well, going into two kind of partly overlapping perspectives. One is of the perspectives focused on the root causes behind the emergence of terrorism in the society, and the second look at violent radicalization and processes and motivations at the individual and group level. But of course there are close connections between these levels, but there tends to be different focus here. I think it's useful to make a distinction between macro, meso, and micro levels of analysis. Macro factors relate to the systemic conditions at the level of society, state or international relations, and transnational developments. For example, example could be civil wars or deep-rooted conflicts, invasion, military invasion or occupation by foreign military forces, economic underdevelopment, bad governance, corruption penetrating all levels of a state. Sorry about that. I thought I'd turn it off. I once was in a concert where the violinist suddenly had this mobile going off in the middle of a concert. So it can happen to better people than me. So root causes of terrorism is often to be identified at this macro level. Meso factors will then relate to conditions, developments, and processes at the intermediate level, such as social movements, institutions, organizations, and groups. Examples could be developments in a terrorist organization. It could be charismatic leaders who mobilize a mass following. It could be the work of intelligence services and peace movements and so on. This is at the meso level. The micro factors relate to individuals and face-to-face interactions in small groups. At this level of analysis, we would try to understand why and how individuals and cliques of friends get radicalized and into engaging in violent activism, and what can be done to prevent this negative development. So if you can understand the root causes and social mechanisms behind the emergence of terrorism at the macro, meso, or micro levels, this insight could help us to eliminate or reduce these causes and reduce the terrorism problem. So this idea has motivated quite a lot of research in this field. And I was involved in one of these projects with this book called Root Causes of Terrorism, which was started as a kind of expert conference. We tried and the outcome, we tried to review the knowledge on root causes of terrorism. But we produced a very complex picture because we, as expected, we could not find one single root cause of terrorism. That was quite obvious. There were quite a few politicians who thought that poverty is a root cause. Including the Prime Minister of Norway, who gave us the mission to do that conference. But there are connections between poverty and emergence of terrorism, but they are of a more indirect kind. You can say that poverty may be part of a broader cluster of systemic factors, which together may provide a fertile ground for the emergence of terrorism, like corrupt governments, nepotism, repression, discrimination, failure to integrate minorities and emerging classes, and so on. So these are conditions which, at least in principle, are possible to change or do something about. But there are other macro factors, such as globalization, rapid modernization, modern information technology, the internet and so on, which we cannot take away or would not like to take away, but they still play a role in facilitating terrorism. But that's only one small role. Most of them are beneficial, but there are also some negative side effects like facilitating terrorism. Nor is it necessarily the same root causes and factors that gave rise to a terrorist organization or terrorist movement which sustains it on the long run. Sometimes they continue for quite other reasons than what brought them up. So we can further differentiate between two different types of causes behind terrorism. One is what we can call preconditions, and the other are precipitants. Preconditions are the conditions that provide a kind of fertile ground for terrorism. They are mainly at the macro level of factors. They're usually relatively general, structural in character, and can help to produce a range of social phenomena and expressions where terrorism is only one among many. But even if the preconditions exist, these are not in themselves sufficient to cause an outbreak in terrorism. Then you need precipitants, which are the type of causes that more directly influence the emergence of terrorism. This could be specific incidents and situations that directly motivate or trigger an outbreak of terrorism. That could be, as I mentioned, a military invasion. It could be publication of blasphemous caricatures of the Prophet. Those publications in Denmark would not have happened had there not been some kind of preconditions of Muslims who were frustrated against the West, and there were some basic conditions, and then this was a kind of the match which brought that flame to carry out. So that is an example of how these precipitants may interact with the preconditions. So it's possible to do. I mean, the question is it possible to do something about some of these preconditions? Some of them we can do something about, like the lack of democracy, the rule of law, illegitimate and corrupt governments, discrimination, social injustice, social political conflicts, and so on. But it may take time for these measures or these changes to take place in order to produce a reduction in terrorist radicalization and recruitment. And sometimes settlements of conflicts are not perfect, but they are sufficient to reduce the level of violence quite a lot. For example, take the case of Northern Ireland, where they have been split off from the IRA, who continue but still at a much lower level, and they are not. The problem of terrorism is not the same as it was when there was a full-fledged conflict. So that is an example. The split off. I mean, the situation with Al-Fatah and Hamas. There was a kind of peace agreement with Israel. It was not perfect, and we got these kind of spoilers with Hamas who continued. So that brings us on to the next one, which is deterrence, which refers to the use of punishment or other negative sanctions as a threat to make someone refrain from carrying out acts of crime or terrorism or other forms of aggression due to the fear of the responses or negative consequences they would result in. The preventive mechanism here is, in the deterrence strategy, is to reduce the motivation of terrorists and their supporters through acts of punishment or reprisals or other negative consequences. The idea is that terrorists are rational actors who calculate the costs of committing acts of terrorism and weigh them against the benefits. And the knowledge that they risk harsh punishment is then intended to change the calculation in a negative direction, such that they choose to refrain from carrying out this act. Whether that actually happens is disputed, and there are a lot of researchers and experts who argue that deterrence does not really work well against terrorists, and it depends really on how motivated they are. But you can use threats of punishment against individuals, against groups, and against states. Deterrence is then based on measures such as various forms of use of military force or police arrests, prison sentences, but it's also possible to use other forms of deadly violence, like using special trained counter-terrorist forces. They can also have a deterrent effect. Military reprisals has been used quite a lot with the intention of having a deterrent effect. Both by, for example, the United States, and Israel has used that quite a lot. For years, for example, Israel had a policy of demolishing the family houses of those who have been involved in terrorist attack, in particular suicide bombers. So suicide bomber or potential suicide bombers would know that if they kill themselves in a suicide or martyr action, their parents would lose their house. That may have a preventive effect, but in reality, it did not seem to work well. And Israel has demolished several hundred houses and have been widely criticized for collective punishment by break of international law. Most European countries have generally argued for a more criminal justice approach rather than a military approach to terrorism. They have been more inclined to promote economic and diplomatic sanctions as a main measure to deter states from sponsoring terrorism. The actors in the deterrence strategy are mainly, it could be police detective and the criminal justice system, police counterterrorism forces or military forces. Political authorities may play key roles in, for example, when it comes to diplomatic sanctions or economic sanctions against countries supporting terrorist organizations. But also in that process, private and public agencies, private companies will have to play a role as well in implementing that. For example, a boycott against states which are providing support to terrorist organizations. The target group for deterrence are people and groups involved or considering committing acts of terrorism or who are already involved in terrorism. So it's both secondary and tertiary prevention. But it could also be states, like we had in the 1980s. There were quite a lot of states like Syria, Iraq, Libya, Iran, North Korea, were states providing or sponsoring terrorist organizations in various ways. And here these measures seem to be quite effective. They were able to get those states refraining from continuing this support to a large extent through various diplomatic and economic sanctions. So the advantage of the deterrence strategy seems to be that they've been quite effective against state sponsors of terrorism. Military reprisals after terrorist attacks have been very popular with some of the general public in countries like the United States and Israel, not least because they portray an image of the authorities and politicians as taking action and not being cowed by terrorists. But here lies the great temptation of these kind of measures, because and also the negative side effects, because it's questionable whether deterrence has a genuine effect on very motivated terrorists, either at an individual or group level. Bombing offices, houses, villages, allegedly used by terrorists has also often had impacted innocent civilians. So in this way, such reprisals have frequently led to new rounds of violence and revenge, and fostering a new recruitment to these movements. There have been several empirical studies trying to assess the outcome and effect of this strategy, and the general finding has been that they have been counterproductive. They have either had no effect or a negative effect on reducing terrorism. And besides this, provoking the state into overreacting is one of the main goals of terrorists. It's classic terrorist strategy. The aim is to provoke governments to react in ways where they weaken themselves by overreacting, undermining their own legitimacy, increasing people's willingness to resist and support the terrorist cause. So I think the alternative way authorities should react is to adhere strictly to the principle of human rights and the rule of law, and respond to acts of terrorism as ordinary crimes that must be dealt with by the police and criminal justice system. I think that should be the first line of defense, rather than starting with revenge and reprisals. But still, we see that not all terrorists, or most terrorists, are not really, they are not being deterred from carrying out terrorist acts. It seems to be a relatively inefficient way to deal with them. And in these circumstances, disruption may be the next prevention barrier. The preventive mechanism in disruption is to stop terrorists from carrying out their attacks by discovering and exposing preparations for attack in advance, and through various means prevent actions from being carried out. So the principal actors here in this disruption strategy is in particular the security and intelligence services and the police, but sometimes the general public may also play important roles in providing information about suspicious activities and informing the police about those. The target group for the measures are people actively planning and preparing acts of terrorism. So this is tertiary prevention. The measures in a disruption strategy will vary from phase to phase. First, you need to have various ways of detecting what is going on, and then various measures to stop the attackers. And here the intelligence services will play a main role. Once a terrorist plot is detected, a recurrent dilemma is whether there is sufficient evidence to convict the people concerned, or whether the risk of serious consequences is too great for the police and security service to wait. They may risk to lose control if they choose to wait the developments and with the expectation of gaining sufficient evidence. So sometimes and there have been a number of cases in Europe where the police and security service have intervened before they had sufficient evidence, and they had to acquit these people afterwards because they could not really convict them for anything wrong. They knew they were plotting, preparing to carry out a terrorist attack, but they had not yet committed a terrorist offense or a criminal offense. That is a big dilemma. In some cases, it's sufficient. I mean, there are various forms of disruption you can use, various forms of methods to stop them. The basic one is, of course, to arrest them, put them behind bars. But there are other means you could also use. Sometimes it's sufficient that the security services and the police make themselves known to people and groups who are carrying out suspicious activities, such that they become aware that an eye is being kept on them. Sometimes I've talked to security service people who said that sometimes they know that they are up to something, and they just contact them and say, we know we are up to, you're preparing something, and we just want you to know that we are keeping an eye on you, and we will stop you if you go further. And quite often that is sufficient. And that is a very cheap way of preventing terrorism. I mean, it's very much. We had a case in Norway when there was a group of, there was a militant, it was a former Taliban minister coming to Norway, and he got a circle of young men around him, and he was trying to radicalize them. And in that case, the security service sort of contacted the members of the group and saying, we know what's happening, and we don't want you to spend the rest of your life in prison, so we can stop now. And nothing happened. I mean, they did not continue. I think they tried to get this Taliban guy out of the country, and they were able to intervene at an early stage. And the alternative would be to wait until they had collected guns, got explosives, and perhaps stop them then and convict them to 10 years in prison. For 7 young men, that would be 70 prison years, costing something like 150 million kroner to keep them in prison that long. It's so much cheaper for society, so much better to stop them early than to wait until they have done something criminal. And in many cases, that will be sufficient, but not always. Then, okay, then keep them, an eye on them, and stop them later and convict them. But doing that at an early stage is a very effective and very cheap way of counterterrorism. And the police in Norway has developed what they call the preventive dialogue method, which they use a lot with young people involved. They started when back in the 90s when they worked with young people involved in neo-Nazi groups. Very systematic way to invite each young person and their parents to the police station for a serious talk. And in most cases that was sufficient and quite effective. And then they have now applied that to militant young Muslims as well. And so it's a soft method which can have a good effect. And I had, now he's a friend of mine, back in 1997 he was arrested by the police. He was one of the worst Nazis in Norway, together with two others. He was arrested for plotting to attack or do something nasty with 4 prominent people, as it would call, and it turned out one of them was me. And he was in prison for a lot of things. They released him for that thing because they could not provide any sufficient evidence. And he broke with the Nazi movements later. He started to study social work. He went on to a master's degree in social work and did a study interviewing ex-Nazis, 9 ex-Nazis, about the process of getting out. And 8 of them had been actually targeted for these preventive dialogues. And all 8 said it had an impact on them, but they didn't think it would have an impact on anyone else. They were wrong. So it does have an impact, and that is important. There are other ways you can disrupt. For example, security checks at an airport may stop weapons and explosives. That's disruption. So there are many ways, and you can see there are many actors here as well. The limitations and side effects of disruption strategy are also substantial. It's likely that some planned actions will not be discovered. I think in Europe there have been a study by a colleague who found in a certain period 57 terrorist plots, relatively well documented. But only 3/4 of these were detected and disrupted by police. Most of the others, fortunately, were failed due to incompetence and other reasons, but 3 or 4 went through to actual attack. So there's quite a few flying under the radar. And in particular, this is a case with plots by solo terrorists or lone wolves. They are particularly challenging to disrupt. I did a kind of count in Scandinavia in the period from October 2009 to October 2011. There were at least 8 or I think there were 9 known terrorist plots in Scandinavia, or involving all kinds of terrorism. 4 of these plots were group-based. They were all detected and disrupted. 5 plots were prepared by solo actors. None of them were detected, but 3 of them failed due to poor preparations and incompetence and so on. But 2 went through. One was Anders Behring Breivik attack 2 years ago in Norway, and the other one was a series of murders or shootings by a person in southern Sweden, the so-called pistol man. So what makes solo terrorists difficult to detect and stop is mainly that they are preparing their attacks in isolation with no communication with others, and it's often the communication which makes it easy to stop them. Another, perhaps a more serious side effect of the disruption strategy is that in order to catch the genuine threats, a large number of people will be subjected to various forms of checks, monitoring, interventions, and in some cases their personal integrity will be significantly violated. So that is a serious side effect, and that there are a lot of people who are being monitored without having any bad intention at all. So moving on to protecting vulnerable targets. Some potential terrorist targets are especially attractive to terrorists because of what they represent. It can be the embassies, government buildings, symbols of the systems, and so on. Or it could be because of the major adverse effects that such attacks would have, for example, on air traffic or other important infrastructure, or that many people could be hurt or killed. So in our context, it's important to try to identify and eliminate opportunities for specific acts of terrorism against such particular attractive targets and reduce that target's vulnerability. So while most of the other prevention measures try to influence terrorists or other criminal actors directly, situational prevention measures try to influence actors indirectly by changing the situations in which these unwanted actions take place. So the means are intended both separately and together to change the rational calculations of terrorists about the costs and benefits of carrying out specific acts of specific attacks, so that they refrain from trying. So this situational prevention strategy provides room for an enormous spectrum of possible measures, both in relation to ordinary crime and terrorism. For example, we have a familiar measure to introduce terrorists is to try to reduce the opportunity for hijacking planes by controlling hand luggage with X-ray and so on before people are boarding an aircraft. And that has proved to be very effective against hijacking, and it had reduced the hijacking problem a lot. Back in the late 1960s, there were hijackings all over the place. There were actually a case where there were two different hijacking teams on the same plane going to both, fortunately both wanted to go to Cuba, so it solved the problem. But I mean, that was the good old days for hijacking. That has been made quite a lot more difficult. But there are then also a large number of different actors who can, in their ways, contribute to these situational prevention strategies by a number of different measures. And we all see them all around us every day. All kind of security checks, cameras, identification things. We get really used to them, but they are everywhere and they are extremely costly. So that's one of the negative side effects of this. Is, I mean, the advantage is that some of them have proven to be quite effective in reducing. You can measure the effect, but they have the backside first, that it's very costly. There's almost no end to all the kind of measure we can take, and even if we, and the problem is that even if we can protect one specific type of one specific target, if that is sort of target hardened, then there are always other softer targets around. And if you don't do anything about the basic motivation, you have this kind of displacement effect. And there is a big debate within the field of situational prevention whether that displacement effect is, how big it is. Some would say that there is a zero effect. They would just go for another place. Others argue that there is a displacement effect, but it's lower than the original threat. So there is a kind of positive benefit. Sometimes you have even a positive kind of displacement of the benefits. You can people believe that there is more security around than there actually is, and they so that can happen. But we have seen in the field of terrorism that when it became more difficult to hijack planes, some terrorists moved to hijacking embassies instead, for example, or they went to bombing planes instead, or hijacking or bombing trains instead of aircraft and so on. So the displacement effect is real. And of course another downside of this is that we get this kind of big brother in society where you always feel that we are under control of something. But still, even if this has a positive effect, there is always this possible for displacement effect, and there is no limit to the kind of targets we need to protect, and it's really basically a kind of symptom treatment. So that is the fundamental backside of this. So then we can move on. Even if we cannot, even if an act of terrorism has not been successfully stopped by some of the other strategies, the next step in the prevention chain would be to reduce the negative consequences and the adverse effect as much as possible. So the preventive effect here lies in doing something in advance to reduce this harm. For example, by planning, coordination, training before an act of terrorism incident take place. So the objectives of this kind of sub-strategy is to save lives, alleviate suffering, reduce fear, restore social functions and infrastructure, and maintain confidence in institutions and authorities after an attack. But the preventive mechanism lies in doing something in advance before things happen in order to reduce these effects. That is what makes it prevention. I mean, and there are many actors who can play roles here, like having fire brigades, medical services. You can put preventive shields on windows. I mean, that saved lots of lives in the government building in Oslo 2 years ago. That they had put these tapes, or what we call them, on the windows. Yeah, films. That was something they did in advance, and it saved lives, lots of lives. I will, to save a bit time, I will move on here and go on to reducing rewards. Terrorists usually have limited means of force. They are unable to achieve their aims through violence alone. So in order to achieve their aims, they are dependent on others reacting to terrorist violence in a manner that affords the terror greater effect than the physical harm can actually achieve in itself. So terrorists try to provoke the authorities and others to react in manners where they weaken themselves. So we have to ask what the terrorists want to get the enemy or get us to do, and what makes these target groups act in a manner that makes terrorist violence effective in the eyes of the perpetrators, and how can we avoid acting like the terrorists want us to act. So we need to know then, the basic question is, what do the terrorists try to achieve? And then we make sure that they don't get what they want to achieve. Terrorist groups have, throughout history, had very different political goals and made use of different types of actions, but they basically try to use some common basic terrorist strategies, which they combine in different ways. The first one is communication. They try to get attention. They try to communicate the message. The second is to create a climate of fear, overreaction, or paralysis. And the third is often some kind of extortion or coercion, getting authorities or others to give in to specific demands or act in specific ways. So what the terrorists try to do is to get specific responses from a variety of target groups. So the counter strategy is then to ensure that we do not act that way, that we avoid responding or at least minimizing these responses as much as we can. So the preventive mechanism is to try to make it less attractive for other terrorists to repeat a form of action that has not provided the desired outcome, return. So here again we have lots of actors. It could be authorities, it could be the public, it could be the media, and the target group are those who have already adopted terrorist means and those who are considering doing so. So we have both tertiary and secondary prevention. I mean, it's very hard to avoid giving a terrorist attack attention. I mean, you could not avoid having a lot of media coverage on 9/11. It was a perfect media event. I mean, it was really a masterpiece in many ways in communication. They attacked the symbolic targets of America's economic, military, and they tried to get the political power. They failed in the last one, but it was well thought out and all on live television. We can all see it directly, and I did. It was horrible and fantastic, and it was kind of, I mean, it was fantastic images. Really, you could not avoid it. So, but then again, can we try to do something about not giving them what they want to do? Take another example. We had in the mid-2000s a series of hostage taking in Iraq of foreign personnel, military personnel, contract workers from a number of different countries, and they were beheaded on live video. And these tapes were broadcast by a number of television stations all over the world for a long time, and this continued until some news editors found out, are we really giving these terrorists editorial control of what we're sending? So they stopped broadcasting these videos, and the beheading stopped as well. Quite striking. So they did not give them anymore what they wanted, and it stopped. Again, you could use the same for some of the others. Not overreacting. I think in one of the good things that happened in Norway after the 22nd of July attacks 2 years ago was that was a response from the politicians, from the public, from the media, that they did not do what the terrorists wanted. It was a very measured response. They did not overreact. It could have been, Breivik wanted a witch hunt on moderate nationalists, as I said it, in order to radicalize them and to become terrorists like himself. It didn't happen. And that some of them say that they play the victim card, but it's not no substance to it. Giving a measured response, we had a very good trial, a very good justice process, and I think we can be proud of that. So giving then, not giving the terrorists what they're after is important. I think I will move on here to save some time. Going to incapacitation. This is the second last, so you can see the light in the end of the tunnel here. Here the mechanism is to remove the capacity or the ability of malicious actors to commit criminal acts through such measures as confinement or physical neutralization, or by reducing their access to tools or targets. People who are kept locked up in prison or who are killed are in a very effective manner prevented from committing terrorist acts or other criminal acts. So this tangible prevention strategy has been used quite a lot to put terrorists out of actions, and sometimes quite effectively so. This strategy has sometimes been quite effective against hierarchical organizations in which the group has been paralyzed when the leadership has been arrested or killed, or where one has succeeded in putting key nodes in a network out of action. So the possible measures here in this incapacitation strategy may range from arresting or incarcerating violent perpetrators, to take away their access to weapons or funding, or to more radical measures such as killing those considered a threat. One recurring counterterrorism strategy has been that of decapitation, cutting off the head of a terrorist organization by arresting or killing the top leader. The operation by US Navy SEALs to assassinate Osama bin Laden last year or 2 years ago was a good example of that. The US and Israeli targeted killings by using drones and missiles against Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or Hamas leaders and fighters are examples of the same strategy. But depriving terrorists of their capacity to carry out acts of terrorism, for example, by refusing them access to explosives, to weapons, to training, are also a form of incapacitation in a broader sense. The destruction of Al-Qaeda's training camps in Afghanistan and they're causing the leadership to flee, helped to significantly incapacitate Al-Qaeda's ability to train, plan, and carry out major acts of terrorism. depriving terrorists of their tools of trade like weapons, explosives, money, intended to finance acts of terrorism is also a measure of incapacitation as well. So the most important actors in this strategy are the military, the police, the prison authorities, but other authorities and control bodies can also play important roles in reducing the capacity of terrorists to get access, for example, to explosive. Just regulations of, let's say, fertilizer is one important way to reduce the access to the precursors of making explosives. So the target group here are mainly those who are directly involved in carrying out or planning acts of terrorism. The advantage of the incapacitation strategy is that it's an effective and tangible way of putting key activists and groups out of action. This has applied in particular to groups with a limited number of members and where new recruitment is limited and or where a lot of activities are dependent on a few key leaders. That is often the case with hierarchical organizations. But there's little doubt that the American effort to take out the leadership of Al-Qaeda has had a devastating effect on the organization's ability to carry out or coordinate major attacks. But there are also significant cost limitations and disadvantages of this incapacitation strategy, especially when it's used as a primary strategy. It's doubtful that incarcerating or killing lots of individual activists in itself has a very limiting effect on groups that have a high level of recruitment and a broad social base. Instead, we'll see that innocent people are also often impacted by these measures, either in the force of mass arrest or the use of military force, the US and Israeli use of targeted killing of Taliban and Hamas activists often harm innocent civilians and children and others. The Obama administration's increased use of drones to kill suspected terrorists has also been described by the UN and legal experts as extrajudicial killings and a breach of international law because these attacks take place outside armed conflict zones regulated by the laws of war. Heavy-handed repression may reinforce the recruitment and the motivation to use extreme violence, and it may also strengthen the social and political base of some of these movements. And also violent repression by some governments to crush these movements have also had as a consequence that the state itself make use of terrorist methods, undermining its own moral and legal base and their legitimacy both in relation to their own population and to the world society. And that is often one of the goals of the terrorists, to get them to do that. And also the too heavy-handed use of force can undermine more long-term prevention strategies to reduce recruitment by reducing the sources for example, to reduce the sources of frustration and political conflict and that provide the kind of the growth conditions for terrorist movements. So I think incapacitation should be considered as a sub-strategy that must be applied selectively in combination with other more long-term strategies to achieve a lasting reduction in terrorism. That brings me to the last of the 9 mechanisms, which is disengagement, which involves getting individuals and groups involved in terrorism to give up their participation in activities such that's what we call disengagement or desistance or exit processes. So here the preventive mechanism involves bringing about an end to individual terrorist careers and collective terror campaigns, such that, for example, the individual or the group is no longer involved in terrorist activities. So that the desired outcome of such a process is that terrorist violence ceases or at least is reduced. But there have been a kind of prevailing belief for a long time that once a terrorist, always a terrorist, and that the only way to get them to cease their terror activities is through physical incapacitation, either imprisonment or death. But there have been now, during the last few years, increasing or a lot of research showing that terrorist careers and campaigns can be ended in a number of ways, and for a number of reasons. Of course, some end because people are killed or put in prison for a long time, but many give up terrorism because they choose to do so, more or less voluntarily. So the main goal must be to get more to quit earlier rather than later, before they have had time to inflict suffering on others and before they themselves have had too much blood on their hands. Interrupting a radicalization process early in a terrorist career is better than waiting until the person has or group has managed to do a great deal of harm. The most effective way of preventive terrorist violence in the long term is to get entire terrorist groups to lay down their arms. This has happened in a number of different ways, caused by various factors and processes at different levels. One striking example of how development at the macro level precipitated the demise of a terrorist organization relates to the left-wing Red Army faction in Germany. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, the ideological bankruptcy of the communist model, as well as the collapse of the DDR and its subsequent reunification with the Federal Republic of Germany was the background factor when the remaining Red Army faction activists at large announced in April 1998 that, quote, the urban guerrilla in the shape of the RAF is now history. So that was a macro factor development which had played this role. Another one you can mention the peace treatment in Northern Ireland. That's a kind of macro factor development. But there are many factors at the national level as well as group level which could play a role here. In Egypt, the two largest Islamist terror organizations, the Islamic Group and Jihad, ended their terror campaigns after the leaders of the two organizations realized that the violent struggle was the wrong path. These leaders had provided comprehensive justification for their change to persuade their followers. That was in a way a process at the meso level. And some group gave up terrorism by admitting defeat. That was partly the reason for the Red Army faction in Germany. It was one of the reasons for the Islamic group in Egypt. But also because their leaders are arrested. That was the case with Aum Shinrikyo in Japan or the Shining Path in Peru. Or because they lose popular support, like the Red Brigades in Italy, for example, during the years after the killing of the Prime Minister Aldo Moro. Other end their armed struggle through negotiations and peace agreement, like the IRA or the PLO. In some cases, groups that have previously used terrorist methods came to power. That happened with the FLN in Algeria. It happened also with Fatah to some extent, and even with the ANC in South Africa. So you see this at the different level. In addition to this collective way of disengaging from terrorism, many individuals involved in terrorism also disengage on their own. Members of terror groups leave in different ways and for very different reasons. Usually disillusionment play a role. It could be that they are disillusioned because they realize that their cause is not they are not furthering their cause. They're causing more harm than good. That is especially of those who are mainly involved for political ideological reasons. Others have been recruited because of kind of social reasons, and they realize that they are disillusioned because they feel manipulated by the leaders, that the relations within the groups is not as good as they hoped. There's a lot of paranoia in many of these groups. They thought they would feel here a real community and no one trusts each other. That's not what they hoped for. And others joined for search for action excitement, and they found it was really boring to be a terrorist, or it was too much of a good thing. So many reasons, and this disillusionment some are disillusioned with the leaders because they do not live up to the expectations. They see, we've heard cases from the FARC, for example, which is a left-wing militant group in Colombia, where they found that the leaders did not fulfill the ideals of the movement. They were living their lives in luxury, whereas the rank and file had to live rather miserable lives. But the mechanism involved, both when groups and individuals disengage from terrorism, can be understood as a result of a combination of push and pull factors. Push factors are the negative social incidents and circumstances that make it uncomfortable or unappealing to remain in a specific social environment, whereas pull refers to positive factors attracting the person to a more rewarding alternative. So a policy aimed at encouraging groups and individuals to quit terrorism and political violence has the best chance of succeeding if you can reinforce both the push and the pull factors at the same time. So you need, in a way, both the stick and the carrot to use that. One important conceptual distinction, which should also influence policy development, is a difference between the terms de-radicalization and disengagement, or radicalization and engagement. De-radicalization should be seen mainly, or radicalization, de-radicalization should be mainly seen as a change in values and ideas away from embracing radical and violent ideologies and policies, whereas disengagement is a change in behavior by discontinuing or breaking off participation in violent groups and activities. And so values and ideas may or may not change when someone disengages. You may have disengagement without de-radicalization, or sometimes de-radicalization comes later. There is the kind of common sense idea is that first you have to change people's mind and then they will change their behavior, but that is usually not the case. I found in my research on right-wing extremist young people that they did not join a racist group because they were racist. They became racist as a consequence of having joined that group for other, often social reasons, and the same happened in the way out. So these two processes of radicalization and engagement and de-radicalization, disengagement, they are related, but they are loosely related processes. Which come first may differ. So you have some people who no longer believe in the political cause, but they continue to participate in terrorist activities because they have no alternatives. They have sort of burnt the bridges, they have got blood on their hands, they have no way out. So they continue. So if you can provide an exit, that is a possible way for them to stop their involvement. But I think this raises the question of what should be the most important goal of a policy aiming at getting terrorists or other political extremists to quit. That they change their behavior, or that they change their mindset. And I think changing their behavior is more important. They can believe whatever they want as long as they don't cause harm to other people. So I think disengagement is more important than de-radicalization. But sometimes disengagement with de-radicalization is providing more safety that they won't return. So that is the ultimate goal. But quite a few disengage and they keep onto their militant beliefs, but they don't act on them. Yeah. Well, the measures vary based on whether we're talking about a collective or an individual process of disengagement, and whether they are aimed at people who are in prison or not. Some measures depend to a greater degree on a voluntary choice to break with violent extremism, whereas other measures involve a large degree of coercion. And quite often there's a combination or something in between. You can have negotiations to persuade terrorist groups with a substantial proportion of the members still at large to lay down their weapons, but usually that is only effective if they have, so there is a kind of coercion behind it. In some countries in which hundreds of participants of terror movements are imprisoned, the authorities will offer full or partial amnesty, most often to those who agree to participate in various forms of re-socialization or de-radicalization programs to ensure that they are no longer a threat to to society. You have a number of these programs all over the world now in a number of Muslim countries. We've seen them in Colombia, in Italy, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, to mention a few, Afghanistan as well. Usually these programs involve some kind of amnesty, usually not offered to those who have committed more serious crimes, but this varies a little bit. Some of them are prison-based, usually, most of them are there. Other types of programs target defectors from militant extremist groups, primarily people who are not yet in prison or who themselves choose to break with the group. Then the purpose is to offer a way out for individuals who otherwise would be trapped in a violent social environment, and thus prevent them from continuing their destructive activities. I was involved in establishing the first so-called exit program for participants in neo-Nazi and racist groups in Norway back in 1996-97. It started in Norway, went on to Sweden, where they're still continuing after 15 years, this program. And it's another exit program in Germany, both an NGO program and a governmental so-called Aussteiger program. You have it in a number of other countries as well. These are mainly targeting people who are not in prison, so that's a different. There are also rehabilitation program from defectors from the FARC guerrillas, for example, in Colombia, to give an example. The advantage of trying to get terrorist entire groups to give up terrorism collectively is, of course, that this can help to bring a terrorist campaign to an end. I mean, that is the ultimate form of counterterrorism, if you can achieve that. But also, when individuals are quitting, that can also help to reduce the size and capacity of a terrorist group, especially if many people quit without the ranks being replenished by new recruits. And sometimes also the fact that some of the former participants can help to reduce recruitment by telling their stories about the stark truth about how these movements, life in these movements are, breaking down the kind of romanticized image of these movements, which make them attractive to young people. But this strategy has a lot of advantages, but also some limitations. And I think one of the main problems is that some of the amnesty programs have been misused to get out of prison quickly and then return to terrorist activities. That has happened. Another problem is that terrorists with blood on their hands are working around freely. In some countries, like in Northern Ireland, they are back in government even. And you have the victims of these people having to suffer to see these people who have killed my brother or my son or my father, and they are there walking around. That is undermining their sense of justice and the rule of law. So some kind of process is important. So to conclude, one of the major challenges of preventing terrorism can be to find this appropriate balance between short-term and long-term prevention strategies, between the repressive and the constructive measures. The more repressive and controlling strategies are necessary to curb immediate acute terrorist threats. But these strategies do not necessarily reduce the terrorist threat in the long term. So long-term strategies aim to reduce recruitment, violent radicalization, and terrorism through building normative barriers, reducing the root causes for the emergence and recruitment of terrorism, and getting terrorists to disengage individually as a group. And these strategies can, if they succeed, remove the fundamental motivations for employing violence to achieve political goals. These strategies work primarily by reducing terrorism in the long term, and sometimes the time horizon can be very long. One cannot wait 3 or 10 or 15 years if bombs are exploding around us. So in these circumstances, it is necessary to have more repressive strategies to stop and reduce the terrorist threat here and now. So we need this balance. But one important reason for developing a broad, comprehensive strategy that employs multiple preventive mechanisms and measures instead of focusing just on a narrow range of repressive measures and mechanisms, is that it makes it possible to reduce the pressure from each individual measure. If the focus is narrowly on deterrence, disruption, protecting vulnerable targets, the measures have to be very heavy and repressive in order to achieve sufficient effect. But this heavy-handed approach will also produce a lot of negative side effects. So, on the other hand, if one relies on a broader strategy, employing a multiple preventive mechanism, this can construct more barriers than can catch potential terrorist acts. That means that every kind of preventive component, a measure, does not need to be as heavy for the total effect to produce adequate protection. So this broad and holistic approach can serve to lighten the pressure from the more repressive prevention measures and reduce the negative side effects. So the idea of my book is to develop, a kind of general holistic model for preventing terrorism, but also to develop a more general model for crime prevention, here applied to one specific form of crime, which is terrorism. But I think one exciting challenge is to demonstrate that this model can be applied to most other forms of crime. And that's what I'm working on now. So I mentioned some of the examples. But I think the main point made is that terrorist violence is or should be considered as a form of crime and should be treated as such, applying the full repertoire of crime prevention mechanisms and measures. So, yeah, well, you've seen the movie? Yeah, so here it is. Well,
thanks.
that's it.